Welcome to Underwire History. King Philip IV of Spain ascends to the throne in 1621, marking the beginning of a 44-year reign that will shape European politics and culture. The Habsburg dynasty has held power for centuries, but Philip's rule will be defined by his own distinct approach to governance and foreign policy. As he takes the reins, Philip faces a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and economic challenges that will test his mettle as a leader. The 30 Years' War has ravaged Europe, leaving a power vacuum that various nations are eager to fill. Spain's colonial empire is also facing threats from emerging global powers, including the Dutch Republic and England. In this context, Philip must navigate the delicate balance of international relations while addressing domestic issues such as economic stagnation and social unrest. The crown's finances are strained, and Philip will need to make difficult decisions about taxation and resource allocation to maintain Spain's position on the world stage. As he begins his reign, Philip IV is keenly aware of the importance of projecting power and image through architecture, art, and culture. His rule will be marked by significant investments in these areas, which will have far-reaching consequences for European aesthetics and politics. King Philip IV ascends to the throne amidst the chaos of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that has left Europe weakened and vulnerable to external pressures. The war has created an environment where great powers like Spain are forced to prioritize their military might over economic stability and domestic welfare. As he begins his reign, Philip faces a stark choice: divert precious resources towards maintaining a bloated army or invest in the crown's crumbling finances. Spain's colonial empire is under siege from rival nations, including the Dutch Republic, which has emerged as a major naval power in the Caribbean. Philip's advisors warn him that Spain cannot afford another costly war, but he is also aware that military prestige is essential to maintaining the country's international influence. The crown's strained finances have led to widespread discontent among merchants and artisans, who are pressing for economic reforms and greater representation in government. To address these challenges, Philip must navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries between European nations, all while managing his own court's internal politics. The ruler is also under pressure from the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, who is seeking to reassert Habsburg dominance over a fragmented Europe. As tensions escalate across the continent, Philip IV finds himself increasingly isolated in his pursuit of Spanish interests, forced to make difficult decisions that will have far-reaching consequences for his kingdom and beyond. King Philip IV's ascension to the throne in 1621 marked a critical turning point for Spain, as he faced the daunting task of reviving the country's economy and military might. The war-weakened state was vulnerable to external pressures, with the Dutch Republic emerging as a major naval power in the Caribbean, threatening Spain's colonial empire. Philip's advisors cautioned against another costly war, but he was aware that maintaining military prestige was essential for Spain's international influence. To address the crown's strained finances and growing discontent among merchants and artisans, Philip had to navigate complex alliances and rivalries between European nations. The Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II also sought to reassert Habsburg dominance over a fragmented Europe, adding pressure on Philip IV to make difficult decisions. With his court's internal politics and external pressures converging, Philip IV found himself at a crossroads, forced to weigh the costs of military expansion against economic stability and domestic welfare. As he pondered these competing demands, Philip IV's vision for Spain's future began to take shape, marked by significant investments in areas that would have far-reaching consequences. These strategic decisions would not only shape the course of European politics, but also influence aesthetics, as the art and culture of the continent were deeply intertwined with its power dynamics. In this pivotal moment, King Philip IV's leadership would determine whether Spain could reclaim its position as a dominant world power or succumb to internal decay and external pressures. Philip IV's accession to power in 1621 had significant implications for Spain and set the stage for far-reaching repercussions across Europe. As he weighed these competing demands, King Philip IV's vision for Spain's future began to take shape, marked by significant investments in military modernization and colonial expansion. These strategic decisions would have significant governance consequences, as they would require the establishment of new administrative structures and institutions to manage the expanded territories. The Spanish monarchy's ability to maintain control over its vast empire would depend on its capacity to adapt to these changes and balance competing interests within Europe. King Philip IV of Spain begins his 44-year rule, unfolded through interacting constraints rather than one isolated trigger. Decision-makers operated within institutional limits, and each response narrowed the next available option. The evidence points to compounding risk rather than a single dramatic cause. That causal chain becomes clearer when incentives, governance, and timing are read together. Under King Philip IV, the Spanish Empire's bureaucracy grew increasingly complex. The king's focus on military modernization and colonial expansion led to increased costs and resource demands. As a result, the Spanish crown faced significant financial burdens, forcing it to seek creative solutions to maintain its position as a dominant world power. This period saw the development of new systems of taxation, including the imposition of excise taxes and other measures to generate revenue for the state. The strain on resources had a ripple effect, influencing social dynamics and economic structures throughout Europe. Philip IV's preference for mercenary forces over a standing army sparked discussions about the nation's character and military prowess. This shift in military strategy raised questions about the role of the Spanish army in defending its territories and maintaining colonial control. As tensions between Spain and European powers like France and England intensified, King Philip IV was forced to navigate complex webs of alliances and rivalries to secure his empire's survival. The financial burdens placed on the Spanish crown led to increased corruption among high-ranking officials who exploited their positions for personal gain. In 1628, King Philip IV appointed a new council to oversee the administration of the colonies in an effort to curb abuses and restore fiscal responsibility. However, this move only served to create more bureaucratic red tape, slowing down decision-making processes and hindering effective governance. The consequences of these developments were far-reaching, with the Spanish Empire's reputation for efficiency and effectiveness beginning to erode. In addition, the strain on resources led to increased competition among European powers for access to colonies and trade routes, fueling tensions that would eventually contribute to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618. The war marked a turning point in the Spanish Empire's fortunes, as it struggled to maintain its grip on territories and control over colonial resources. The financial costs of the war were staggering, with estimates suggesting that the Spanish crown lost nearly 50% of its revenue between 1620 and 1640. In response, King Philip IV was forced to implement further reforms, including the creation of a new system of taxation and the reduction of government spending on non-essential projects. These measures had some success in stabilizing the economy and reducing the empire's debt, but they also served to further concentrate power in the hands of the monarch and his advisors. The long-term consequences of these developments were profound, with the Spanish Empire emerging from this period weakened and its position as a dominant world power increasingly precarious. The Spanish crown's financial struggles had significant implications for the administration of the colonies, leading to increased corruption among high-ranking officials. The new council, appointed by King Philip IV in 1628, was tasked with overseeing the colony's finances and implementing reforms. However, the council's efforts were hindered by a lack of clear authority and competing interests among its members. The strain on resources also led to conflicts between European powers over access to colonies and trade routes, further eroding the Spanish Empire's reputation for efficiency and effectiveness. In 1629, the Dutch East India Company was granted a charter by the Dutch government, allowing it to establish trading posts and forts in the Indonesian archipelago. The company's success in establishing a foothold in the region marked a significant challenge to Spanish control over trade routes and resources in Southeast Asia. The consequences of these developments were far-reaching, contributing to the erosion of Spanish dominance in global trade and commerce. In 1631, the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II began to exert pressure on King Philip IV to join him in his conflict with Protestant states in Europe, further straining the Spanish Empire's resources and threatening its position as a dominant world power. The strain on resources led to increased borrowing from European banks, which came with high interest rates and strings attached. The Spanish crown was forced to grant concessions to these lenders, allowing them to extract valuable resources and influence policy decisions. In 1632, the Dutch West India Company established a series of fortified trading posts along the coast of South America, further encroaching on Spanish territory and control over trade routes. Philip IV's advisors counseled him to adopt extreme remedies for the empire's dire fiscal troubles, such as disposing of government-held properties and levying severe taxation upon the people. However, these policies only served to exacerbate the economic crisis, leading to widespread discontent among the nobility and rising calls for reform within the Spanish Empire. The once loyal vassals of the crown began to defect or rebel against their monarch's rule, taking advantage of the empire's weakness to further their own interests. In 1633, a delegation of high-ranking officials from the Dutch East India Company met with King Philip IV in an attempt to negotiate a trade agreement and secure concessions for their company. However, the negotiations ultimately failed due to the conflicting interests of the two sides, highlighting the depth of the Spanish Empire's economic and strategic crisis. As tensions between the Spanish crown and its creditors continued to escalate, a group of powerful nobles began to secretly collaborate with the Dutch East India Company, seeking to leverage their influence in exchange for concessions and protection from their creditors. The collapse of these negotiations marked a turning point in the decline of the Spanish Empire's dominance, as the once stable relationships between European powers began to fray under the strain of financial and strategic pressures. The strain on resources led to increased borrowing from European banks, which came with high interest rates and strings attached. The Spanish crown was forced to grant concessions to these lenders, allowing them to extract valuable resources and influence policy decisions. Philip IV's counselors advised him to implement drastic financial remedies, such as asset sales and heavy taxation, but this only deepened the empire's economic troubles. The once loyal vassals of the crown began to defect or rebel against their monarch's rule, taking advantage of the empire's weakness to further their own interests. In 1633, a delegation of high-ranking officials from the Dutch East India Company met with King Philip IV in an attempt to negotiate a trade agreement and secure concessions for their company. However, the negotiations ultimately failed due to the conflicting interests of the two sides, highlighting the depth of the Spanish Empire's economic and strategic crisis. As tensions between the Spanish crown and its creditors continued to escalate, a group of powerful nobles began to secretly collaborate with the Dutch East India Company, seeking to leverage their influence in exchange for concessions and protection from their creditors. The collapse of these negotiations marked a turning point in the decline of the Spanish Empire's dominance, as the once stable relationships between European powers began to fray under the strain of financial and strategic pressures. The Dutch East India Company's aggressive expansion into Spanish territories and trade routes further eroded the empire's control and influence. Thanks for listening to Underwire History. Look forward to seeing you next time.